This is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional
unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we are going to talk about a difficult and important issue, and an issue that's crucial to the future of our democracy, the exclusion of Hispanic citizens and residents from many American universities and other institutions in our society, why this exclusion seems to be endemic to so many of our institutions, and how history can help us recognize it and do something about it. We're joined by my very distinguished colleague, Professor Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra. He is the Alice Drysdale Sheffield Professor of History at the University of Texas. He's one of the leading world authorities on the history of encounters between citizens of and residents of the Americas and those who come from outside the Americas. He's written many articles and books, 3 books in particular: How to Write the History of the New World, the Puritan Conquistadors. It's wonderful to call the Puritans conquistadors. Very, very subversive of you, Jorge. And Nature, Empire, and Nation, which I believe grew out of his dissertation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I used to teach. So we have that connection among many things. I just wanted to read you, before we move on, a short excerpt from Jorge's webpage, which I think really captures what he does and the excitement around his work. He writes, "The core of my intellectual project has been to demonstrate the deep formative role of Latin America to the colonial history of the United States and to the history of Western modernity as a whole. Not just slavery, globalization, and capitalism, where Jorge and others have written about this, but also even deeper issues: science, abolitionism, and democracy are subject here today." So we're very fortunate to have Jorge. Welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you.
It's delightful to have you here. Before we turn to our discussion, of course, we have our scene-setting poem from Mr. Zachary Suri. What's the title of your poem today, Zachary?
Exclusion is a funny word.
Well, let's hear it.
Exclusion is a funny word. It rattles through my tongue, sweeping like a tidal wave. It is a feeling we have all known, swinging sweetly on tree branches from a young age like scout finch, except in an urban jungle. We have known it cross through our minds like those long needles that pin down giant butterflies in stuffy museums. When it is spoken in quiet, rushed voices by our parents on the other side of the bathroom door. And everyone was once just a voyeur on America's coattails, just an observer of democracy from the top of the stairs. And we were children then, driving past the east side on the towering concrete interstate, staring up at the little bits of light showing through the gaps in the highway above. Exclusion is the distance between a child holding an empty ice cream cone and the melting pool of ice cream on the ground measured in lumens. The unbalanced coexistence between walls and sunshine, like the flowers that bloom through the cracks in the concrete. And exclusion is the lifeblood of hatred, the end-all be-all of corruption, sagging through the window like raindrops in heavy wind. And there is yet beauty in sorrowful songs that sear into my brain from the records of my youthful days spent sifting through record stores and doing homework with Otis Redding. There was a wonderful bitterness in the way the light streams through the live oaks on the run-down streets on weekday evenings that makes me cry. And there is tenderness in the eyes of the homeless man on the highway, but there is suffering in his feet.
That's a very evocative poem, Zachary. What is your poem about?
Well, my poem is really about how horrible exclusion is and how much suffering it creates and how much talent it puts down, but at the same time, how in many ways those who suffer the most have produced some of the greatest benefits for our society and some of the greatest beauty.
That's a really important insight. Jorge, do you agree with that? Does that resonate with you?
Well, first of all, I think you are a great poet.
Thank you.
I am a poet myself, and I am impressed.
We need to have your poetry on next time.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. I've been doing poetry for 40-some years.
Wow.
Never published anything, but I like poetry. I enjoy it. I write often. I think it's a very difficult craft.
Yes.
It's not easy. But so I congratulate you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing what you did. I mean, you do it every week.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wow. Well, what I can say, I think you're right. In certain respects, I think it's complicated, and we'll be talking about
it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So why in a society that claims to be open and democratic, why have going back to the beginning in a sense, where you're the foremost expert, Jorge, why have Hispanic peoples been excluded in our society?
That is a good question. I think it has to do with the exclusion of a great many people. It's not just Hispanics. I mean, African Americans, Asians, at different stages. I think the problem with Hispanics is that the issue of exclusion is not being addressed and is not being identified, and worse, is not being solved. The Hispanics, for some reason, remain invisible. African Americans do not. They have organized. They demand justice and integration, and they fight very, very hard against marginalization, and they have powerful political voices. I don't think Hispanics do. I'm not entirely clear why. It might be the great diversity of peoples within Hispanic communities. Cubans do not get along with Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans don't get along with, Mexicans. Mexicans don't get along with whoever is it they have to get along. And at the end, there is no unity, and there is no common goals, I would say. That you could say that, for instance, in the elections in Florida. I mean, it reminds to me a puzzle, really an existential puzzle that people in Florida would... Latinos would have elected Trump, would have voted for Trump.
Right.
Or Scott recently said, wow, what?
Right.
But yet they do.
Right.
So how could that be possible? That you don't see that in the case of African Americans. There is far more consciousness and unity and
predictability in how they vote.
Predictability too.
Yes.
So I am here partly because I'm puzzled by this.
Is this a long-standing issue? Do you see this? I mean, because again, your work goes back to the 16th century, right? Do you see this issue, particularly of Hispanic disunity and the racial complexity of Hispanics? Do you see that as a long-standing historical issue?
I think it is. I think in the case of the United States, it is visible in that many Hispanics see themselves as white or aspire to be white.
Yes.
Aspire to be white, whether they are received as white is something else, but they aspire to be white. Many of them are mixed, racially mixed, mongrel, and some of them, I mean, in families you see that variety and diversity. You see that in my family. I have brothers who are very brown and brothers who are, I would be considered white. I'm considered white, I'd say, if I walk on the street and don't open my mouth or don't tell him my name. So then my father was, let's say, a mestizo, petite Mexican-looking guy. My mother is very white with blue eyes. So we have these mix, these rainbow, all sorts of hues and tones within our own family. And so that is, I think, one reason. And there's a lot of racial tension and consciousness even within families. I experienced that in my own family. Lena, my wife, has experienced that within her own family. These kind of hierarchies within close households, the good son, the good daughter, the not good son, the not so very good son.
And these are racially defined within a family. Interesting. And so the lighter skin being favored over the darker skin? Interesting.
Yeah. Mothers, fathers or family. Remember my father telling the anecdote of when he was born. I guess he didn't hear any of these, but his mother would tell him when he was growing up. He said, when you grew up, when you were born, our family would come by and to congratulate me. But then when they saw you, they would say, "Oh, don't worry, Clementina. Remember the president at the time. This is the 30s, who was an Indian." Isidro Ayora became president. So there's a chance. There's a chance.
The black sheep can do well.
For him to succeed. So that would be a typical experience. Yes.
And so you've experienced this, and you're a historian of this. You've studied this more than anyone else. Why does this get recreated? Why has this not gone away? My students would be surprised. Maybe they wouldn't be surprised, but many of them would be surprised to say that after all this time, after all this emphasis on racial equality since the civil rights movement, and in all of these societies that which have had these movements, why does this get?
I think because the issues of racial and social mobility in Latin America are far more fluid than they are here in the United States. So it allows for the concealing of these tensions. So, for instance, we have the first black. The president of Mexico was Guerrero, who in the 1830s, he passed the new constitution of 1830 that abolished slavery, that led to the War of the Alamo here, because, after all, Santana came to abolish slavery. That is the first battle of the Civil War. It's often forgotten. And so you have the first president of Mexico after the empire is black.
Right.
Then you have a president of Mexico, Benito Juarez, who's an Indian.
Yes.
From Oaxaca, in Mixteca, from central Mexico, who became president. And you have lots of Mexican intellectuals who were Indian. And then Porfirio Diaz, who was the kind of big dictatorship in Mexico in the late 19th century, was himself an Indian too. Mm-hmm. So you see these, you don't have these racial boundaries that are as sharp and divisive as they are in the United States. You don't have that within the Latino Hispanic community. For instance, one of the things that it really struck me when I came to Texas and learned about something about the history of Texas is that in the Constitution of 1841, if you are a black who is manumitted, you have to leave the state by constitutional law, which is striking because by 1530s or 1540s all over Tierra Firme, Panama, Colombia, the coast of Cartagena, etc., you have 80% of the population. Settlers in those areas are free black communities. So the first settlers of the United States, what today's United States are blacks in Florida, free black communities. So the majority of the black population in Latin America, by and large, even when there was slavery and they are kind of incorporating millions of slaves, literally, to plantations, etc., the free black population always remain larger than the enslaved population.
Interesting.
But nevertheless, race was always there. So you have that tension between social mobility, families where calidad, where honor is more important than actual color of the skin. You can be black and be considered white.
Right.
If you have enough income and you dress appropriately.
Interesting.
It's not uncommon. So status is not necessarily tied to the color of the skin. It's tied to social capital, not necessarily just cash.
Which makes it harder to confront in certain ways, right?
Yeah, it's more difficult to pinpoint, to say, well,
Gotcha.
Because, it happens within families.
Right, obviously. Wow, that's a very powerful point. Zachary, you had a question?
Yeah. How have Hispanics, after immigrating to the United States, balanced wanting to stay true to not only being Hispanic, but their individual, like whether they're from Cuba or from Colombia, their individual ethnicities, and being American and assimilation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I am an American. I lived the longest in the United States, 31 years already. I love this country. My father first came to this country as a young man, 18, was recruited he came as a hospital orderly to work in New York, and he was recruited to the army and sent to Korea, fought 3 years in field hospitals and became a hospital orderly during battle, survived Korea, and then he could not get into college here as a Hispanic because he looked Mexican.
Wow.
So all his pals, one African American and one white, got into college and became physicians, his best friends, in the United States. And he had to leave the United States to study medicine and went to Mexico. And then he always had these relationship with the United States of kind of love, admiration, but also longing. And so I grew up with this odd relationship to the United States. And eventually came here for whatever reasons, went to college, went to graduate school, and without the language, without English. I came without a single word of English, and had to learn it, became fascinated by language, fascinated by the structure of grammar, syntax, alliteration, rhythms, cadence. I tried to master the language, actually. I spent years working hard on writing, on reading, on speaking. And slowly, and then I had my kids, and then they are Americans, and they. But at the same time, in the household, we always kept this sense of belonging to Ecuador. Our language, our customs, and et cetera, the things we eat, our festivities, the things we celebrate, everything was kind of always looking back to us, all the families, I guess, who are immigrants. And so we kept that and always been there. And even my kids remain with that strong identity. So my daughter would call herself Quiteña. She's never lived actually in Ecuador. She's spent months there, but she's never lived there. And yet she sees herself very much as part of Ecuador, Ecuadorian.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So part of the point here is, unlike the categories that we deploy in our demography and in our social science, in fact, most people live among many categories, and our identities are not captured by being American or Ecuadorian, but actually some combination of all of those things. And for Hispanics, this is particularly true because most Hispanics, or many at least, share the kind of background you're describing of multi-countries, maybe even multiple religions.
Right.
As
but
such.
I cannot, and this is the thing, I cannot be an American. I am reminded constantly that I am not, that I do not belong. In many different ways, subtle or not so subtle. So it's not me who doesn't want to be fully integrated. It's just the system that keeps reminding me that I'm not really in the club. So which is actually the reason why we're here.
Exactly. And so as we've been discussing in many contexts, these challenges within universities and within cities and within many of our institutions that claim to be progressive. You've made this point many times, and maybe you can elaborate for us on what are the sources of exclusion that you feel in this context.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I told many people already, I was turning into a Latino here in Texas. I wasn't a Latino. I swear, I wasn't into Latino politics. I was the farthest away from. I mean, I thought it was silly, to be honest. But I was turning into a Latino here. Why? Well, that is a good question. I think it has to do with the slow realization that who I was, my name, my accent, I have an accent, my background made me different. And I was constantly reminded about it. So I began to explore this issue of Hispanics in universities and began to find striking patterns. Like, for instance, the university has about 2,000 tenure and tenure-track faculty. There are 120 who are Hispanics. Now, Hispanics are defined here in kind of funny ways because at least 10 of those 120 are Italians and Spaniards.
Oh, that's it.
Yes. Who happen to have the highest salaries of all Hispanics.
Huh.
Then there is a cap in the salaries of all those 110 Hispanics the leftover, that cannot be crossed. There's a threshold in the salary of all these 110 individuals who cannot be crossed, regardless of merit, regardless of publication, regardless of anything. It is stuck there. And there are substantive differences, gaps in salaries across the board. Associate professors, assistant professors, an average of about $21,000 with whites and even blacks, constant throughout. So it's not specific to any location. Now, the other thing that is striking in this university is also the distribution of these 120 or 110 individuals that reinforces the category of the Latino or Hispanic, which is they belong in ghettos. So it's not an even distribution because, there is only 2 Hispanics in law out of 250 faculty, of which one is Argentinian, white Argentinian, so with a European name. And then there is one in LBJ out of I don't know how many faculty. And there is none in about 50% of the departments and institutes and centers of campus. None.
Even large departments.
None. So if you take 85% of centers, departments, and units in this campus have between 0 and 1 Hispanic. So the majority of Hispanics, called Hispanics by legal terms, are clustered in certain areas. So, of course, Spanish and Portuguese, which so wherever I go, when I open my mouth and I say, I work at UT, the first question is, oh, so you teach Spanish? No, I do Chinese medieval physics.
Right. Why not?
Why not? And that is the problem, that most of our kids on campus see these as the default position. They see their role models as teaching Spanish or teaching anthropology or teaching ethnic studies, Mexican studies. They don't see them in roles of quantum physics or, Chinese medieval physics or whatever.
Right.
Whatever. No, there are certain role models that these kids get used to. So there's that. So the clustering of faculty in certain areas. Then there is the issue of, I already said numbers, but with the students, you see these striking numbers. We have about 40% of the population of Texas is considered Hispanic or Latino, Latinx. Yet, when it comes to the high school population, it's 48%. Okay, it's almost the majority of the population in high schools. Yet, these universities is the only non-Hispanic service institution in the state. So we don't have the threshold of 25% students to be a Hispanic service institution. We only have 23% admission rate. And the more you dig into it, the more striking it becomes. Why? We have 2 systems of admissions. One is called the holistic admission, and the other is the 10% rule. 10% rule admits 28 to 29% Hispanic automatically. So if we were to use the 10% rule, we will have 28 to 29% population Hispanic.
And just to explain to our listeners, that 10% rule means if you're in the top 10% or so of your class, you automatically get in to
Texas.
UT in Texas, right?
Yes, over.
So these are Hispanic students who are in the top 10% of their class. They get in. No one has any say over that.
10% admission rule would guarantee some diversity.
And so about 1 in 3 under that are Hispanic. You said 29%.
28, 29, yes.
So a little less than 1 in 3 are Hispanic.
Yes.
Who get admitted that way.
Well, 1 in 4, a little closer to 1 in 4.
Okay, 1 in 4.
But it's fine. It'll cross the threshold of Hispanic service institution. But it doesn't. Why? Because we have holistic admissions. Holistic admissions is being presented by the institution as a way of encouraging diversity, right? Yet holistic admissions actually is a great affirmative action plan for whites because it completely switches from 28% to 23, 22%. So the great majority of people who are admitted through holistic admission system are whites. And yet the administration has fought in court, in the Supreme Court, twice over the right to have holistic admissions under the guise that holistic admissions actually encourage diversity. It does the opposite.
At least for Hispanics.
At least for Hispanics, yes. I think it's also the case for blacks. Actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So this is something that requires some reflection and dialogue and reflection in the wider university community, because most of our colleagues just assume that that we are doing well through holistic admissions. We're not.
Right. So, Jorge, if I might ask you, in a sense, these are facts that most of us, myself included, didn't know in the same degree of detail, but they're pretty undeniable. You can walk around this campus and you can see what looks like a different demographic from the demographic of Texas as a whole. That's obvious. That's undeniable. Why do you think this is?
Well, I've been reflecting on this. Why the numbers? Why the salaries?
Why are you made to feel like an outsider, as you said?
Yes. Well, another striking statistics. We have studied the UT budget in detail, fine print, and found there are 516 endowed chairs and professorships all over campus. We know that, for instance, in the College of Liberal Arts, of about 118 endowed positions, 38 are endowed chairs. You are one of them. Well, you're not in college, so your endowment belongs to LBJ.
I think my chair is in the LBJ school.
Okay,
yes.
well,
And
so
the
you're not
Strauss
one
Center.
of the 38. But in any event, I am one of 6 endowed professorships in Colon out of 89.
One of 6
Hispanics, yes. And there's only one endowed chair that belongs to an administrative position. It's not really a merit of scholarship. So there are no endowed chairs, period. So that, I would say, makes me feel as an outsider, literally. Because I have I would say, I have the vita and the record to have an endowed chair. I've done everything that would warrant that reward, but it's never happened. And it hasn't happened in the university at large with Hispanics, period. Not in Cola, not in the College of Liberal Arts. Not one of them is good enough to have an endowed chair. That is a good example, but there are many other examples. I mean, we have discussed this in our department. One case is that I've never been elected to the executive committee of my department. Again, it might be at the beginning I thought it was because I am not sympathetic enough. I mean, that is fine. But then if you begin to see these patterns, wider patterns, it so happens that it's widespread. It's not only me, but it's widespread. So most Hispanics on campus are outside networks of authority and hierarchies of authority. There is only 2 deans in the entire university who are Hispanics, and these are deans of very poor colleges, education and social work, with very little clout in general. Then there is one example. I just want to put you on one example, which is striking because it's the case of LILAS. LILAS is the Latin American Studies Center, one of the greatest on earth, literally.
Yeah.
Dating back to, this is a surprise to me. I didn't know. I thought it was the product of the Cold War. It is not.
Right. Precedes it.
Right. Precedes. Founded in 1943 or something.
I think so, yeah.
And it has a history of about 80 years or more. 79 years or so. It has had 13 directors, none of them Latinos or Hispanic. We're talking about an institution.
Not a single one.
Not a single one. Not a single one.
So I come back to the question because, again, one could potentially quibble with parts of your data, but your overall point, I think, is a very powerful and undeniable one, that there seems to be a structural inequity in place. And other groups could point this out, too. African Americans could point this out. Various other groups could point to this. It wouldn't look exactly the same. Why?
Why? Well, this is the thing. The situation of African Americans is not as bad.
But in the Hispanic case, why?
Well, that is my point is that it is easier to see inequities for African Americans than to see inequities for Hispanics. That is my entire point. You are asking me why. Well, I think the nature of race in this country that is built on polarities of white and black is made these other groups, but particularly Hispanics, that are kind of in between there, invisible. They just are invisible to the issue of marginalization and inequities. They are a minority. They are some kind of excluded population, but they are not seen. It's very difficult to see them. I would say that would be the reason. I really don't know. I'm struggling. I'm trying to understand and grapple why.
And I think if and this question now, takes us to where we have to close, but it's also opening for our next conversation in a way. It seems to me we have to understand the causes if we're going to find a solution, right? Because I don't think what you're saying, Jorge, is that in a day-to-day basis, you're seeing intentional efforts to exclude.
Not at all.
But you're pointing to something structural. So where do you think, and this will be our ending for this conversation, but in a sense it's a beginning, where do you think, taking your historical analysis, we should go? What should we be starting to do to correct this?
I think the problem, most of the problems, merit, professorships, salary gaps, etc., the lack of access to structures of power in administration, governance, etc., they all go back to the issue of social capital. Social capital explains many things, in my opinion. Explains who gets to elect whom, who gets appointed to what, who is visible, who is not. Who has is seen as trustworthy, who is seen as honorable, who is seen as respectable.
And social capital, just for our listeners to explain, you mean networks, prestige, legitimacy, status, all of these things that, in a sense, are invisible until you don't have them.
Exactly, yes. So there are these things that is social. So who votes for you? Who sees... Who remembers you when they are voting? Oh, that guy. Oh, he's good. Oh, let's vote for him. That it works in such a way that, who will get that? Who will nominate for this teaching position? Oh, that guy. Who will we appoint to this position endowed chair? Oh, that guy. So those who are not visible in these processes get excluded. Now, the issue of social capital can be easily solved. Okay. How? For instance, in our department, we created something that I think is very good. For instance, for teaching prizes, that avoids the issue of social capital when it comes, for instance, to nominations, self-nomination. And we have a committee that decides on the merit whether this really is a good teacher or not.
You don't have to wait for someone to nominate you. You can nominate yourself.
Right. I think that is good. The other thing that that will solve the issue of social capital would be rotation. Rotation in positions of authority and governance. People get to rotate. Just automatically, we avoid the issue of appointments, patronage, and also elections. One thing that I discovered, to my surprise, is that elections lead to segregation. I did a study of 50 years of membership of the faculty council. It's a
the university's faculty council.
University faculty council. To my surprise, I found, this is striking, that in 50 years of the archives of the faculty council, only 2 Hispanics have occupied any position of authority. The last individual who occupied a position of authority did it in 2011. And then there is another chair of a Senate council in 1991, I think. I'm trying to remember the data. So it's two out of hundreds of position of authority in the faculty council. So people do not elect Hispanics, period. They are not good enough for whatever reason. So the vote of the majority creates segregation since there are so few Hispanics. So we 120 do not have the numbers to vote any of us in anywhere. So we are always excluded. We remain excluded because we are very few and because we are invisible. So I think elections are a problem. So we need to address the issue of elections as to how to get to all these positions of authority. And I think rotation is a good way of addressing that in departments or other levels. So those are, for instance, two concrete examples.
Those are excellent
solutions.
examples, and they actually give us a pathway forward. They show also how historical consciousness can actually improve policy. The only thing I would add would be that I think one element of these, this was implied in what you said, is providing the resources and the ability for those in groups that are excluded to actually build social capital. One of the things, and again, this is implied in much of what you said, Jorge, and you said it so well, is when we study groups that have moved from being excluded to being less excluded. I don't know if groups that are excluded ever become unexcluded, but what we find is that they find ways to build social capital. Often with the help from those who are more on the in-group, but often in their own terms building social capital. And one of the things you've been doing very well, I think, is working with other Hispanics on campus to build social capital. Social capital is not something that is God-given. Mm-hmm. Social capital is created, right? And those in power have an obligation to help in its creation, and those who don't have social capital have an obligation, as you're showing, to also work toward their own self-creation of social capital.
I think it has to do a lot with political organization.
Precisely. And I think actually the history of democracy shows that, right? A. Philip Randolph famously said, right, that if you want to get something done in a democracy, organize.
Yes.
Organize.
That I discovered.
and you've provided not only a historical analysis of that, but also an example of that. Zachary, let's close with you. How do you think about these issues? You're growing up in Texas, surrounded by these issues in your school, in your activities. How do you think about these issues?
Well, I think there's still a big problem because a lot of people with less diverse, wealthier backgrounds don't really interact with those lower income backgrounds, both Hispanic and African American. And I think that there's a real problem about a lack of interaction. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of hope because so much of our student population, of our young people, come from so many different diverse backgrounds that there's a real chance for us to learn about each other. And I think that's something that's really important because we see each other every day and we get to know each other as we go through school.
And so the interactions can help overcome some of these historical inheritances, perhaps, right? Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Jorge, you have educated us about the history going way back. You've also given us insights into your own personal experience, and thank you for sharing that with us. And you've given us some important ideas, at least conceptually, for thinking about how to move forward. At the very least, I think you provided us with a clear sense of the problem and how history helps to articulate and open our eyes to, in a sense, that what's staring us in the face that we often don't like to talk about. So thank you, Jorge, for joining us.
It was a pleasure, and it was great meeting you. You are a great poet again.
And Zachary, thank you for your insights and for your poem. Thank you for joining us for this episode of This is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.